And we're joined by Warren Kinsella, and chances are we will do only one topic this time. And we're joined by Warren Kinsella, and chances are we will do only one topic this time, but it's a topic that will consume the American and Canadian news psyche for several days: the death of Brian Mulroney, or MBM, as he was known to many in the political class. That stood for Martin Brian Mulroney. Warren Kinsella, one of the reasons I do a podcast with you is that while you have done partisanship in your life, you don't do partisanship with me. You don't do partisanship in your journalism. You call a spade, and there is no doubt that you prepared Jean Chrétien for many partisan quips and partisan lines in your political life. Jean Chrétien last night showed, and I have no doubt that you will show me today a different side, the human side of Warren Kinsella, reviewing the demise of the Right Honorable Martin Brian Mulroney.
Yeah, it was sad. And I've got I was back to being a journalist again. I hammered out Charles the obit just before deadline. I had to laugh. He's probably laughing where he is, that all of us were scrambling on deadline to get in our Mulroney stories and our Mulroney obits just before deadline. I had to laugh. He's probably laughing where he is, that all of us were scrambling on deadline to get in our Mulroney stories and our Mulroney obits. And the two things I said about him, people can read it for themselves if they want to, is that, you know, I was Chrétien's special assistant, and they overlapped, Chrétien and Mulroney. And my job was to make Mulroney and his government make their lives miserable. And allegedly I wasn't bad at it. But, you know, the extraordinary thing about the guy is, you know, when there was a health scare, one of our team, when they were having some personal tragedy, birth of a kid, the phone would ring and you pick it up and there's that voice. And he said, you know, Kinsella, put your boss on the line. And he was, he's different than the politicians you see today, because he, I think, always remembered that politics is about people. You have to love people. You got to care for people. That's what the job's all about. And he did, you know, and he was an Irish Catholic scrapper from Quebec, like me. And, you know, when you're Irish Catholic from Quebec, you learn how to fight. He knew how to fight. He knew how to win. But there was this big human heart at the center of the guy under all that Irish blarney. And that's what I'll remember.
Before you were a Jean Chrétien liberal, you were a John Turner liberal. I'm confident that you were a John Turner liberal on the campus of Carleton University.
I was indeed.
How did you feel about John Turner taking it on the chin, a devastating right hook from Brian Mulroney in the debate that Turner had with Mulroney, where Mulroney said that John Turner was confessing and that he was guilty? Brian Mulroney in that debate was judge, jury, and hangman. How did you feel about him putting the political noose around a person who you admired a great deal, John Napier Turner?
People get to know you. You've been away for a long time. Let them get to know you. Just wait, just wait. But he wouldn't wait. And he called the election for September the 4th, 1984. And so the War Room, it was kind of the precursor of the War Room that I did for Chrétien in 93. I was in it with Senator Philip Gigantes, and I think they put us together because Gigantes had been a newspaper man in Europe and North America, and I'd worked in newspapers and the media. And I remember I was sitting there and watching. It was in the old days where you had to structure your day around TV. You couldn't watch it on the device. And, you know, that happened, what you just described. And I remember Senator Gigantes turned to me and he said, time for you to go to law school. And that was it, right? I just knew it was done. Picked up the phone, said to my mom and dad, I'm coming home. And I came home on September 4th, 1984 to start law school. And I remember being on the plane and the pilot announced, ladies and gentlemen, the Conservative Party of Canada has got a massive majority. They did. And the whole plane erupted in cheers, except for me. And the woman I was sitting beside looked at me and she said, you don't look very happy. And I said, a lot of my friends just lost their job. And she said, well, you'll come back. And we did. But that was Mulroney. Like, it was like, people don't understand. 1984, September 4th, 1984, biggest majority, I think, in Canadian history, Charles. And he did it, through hard work and charm and vision.
So when John Napier Turner, who was the person who had the royal jelly, he had a tremendous mind. Had there not been a Pierre Trudeau, I'm confident that John Turner, in his prime, would have been prime minister, and probably a very, very effective one. He was a little bit past his prime when Mulroney knocked him out. Many of us were surprised that Turner had a glass jaw that night. That wasn't the John Turner that most of us knew and admired. How did he respond personally to being devastated in that election by Brian Mulroney?
Turner was one of those guys, also a Catholic, who, one of those Catholics, I think, who believes in wearing a hair shirt and flagellating themselves, right? And they think nobility is achieved by continual self-sacrifice. And, the Liberal Party of Canada that night, I remember my dad picked me up at the airport. We're driving back to my folks' home, and Turner came on the radio and he said, the people are always right. And I just lost it. I was so upset. And, but he's right. He was right. He said, basically, we deserve to lose. We deserve to lose. And he worked so hard. And he came close again, Turner did in 88 in that debate that he did with Muldoon on the free trade agreement. And, he said, you want to erase the line between us and the United States. You want to make us the 51st state. And he had Muldoon on the ropes. And, but then, the Mulroney guys were sharp and smart, and they turned it around. They bombed the bridges, as they put it. And Mulroney won another supermajority, and that was it for Turner. But, I think Turner, certainly Chrétien, I know this for a fact, we all respected Mulroney's skills. His political skills were extraordinary. And, Brian Tobin was one of our prosecutors in the House of Commons, and I'd write questions for Brian and the other guys, and sticking it to Mulroney. And, he was really good at it. And then, the day that Tobin's son is born, he gets this box delivered by some guy, and he opens it up, and there's a blue silk tie from Brian Mulroney, handwritten note, right? Like, that's a pro. That's how you do it. And, I was talking on the radio to a couple of your former colleagues this morning, and I said, this is why I don't dig the style of Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre, if you were to take Twitter and turn it into a human, that would be Pierre Poilievre, right? It's just the anger stuff all the time. And like Muldoon and Chrétien, even to some extent Harper, sometimes they liked people. They were good at people. And Mulroney was like that. And I think, I don't know, Charles, honestly, if we'll see the likes of that kind of politician again.
Well, so he was, as you know, when you met me, I was a relatively predictable conservative talk show host. I generally came down on the side of the Conservatives, but I've got to tell you, just in my, personal ballot box life, Brian Mulroney was the last Canadian Conservative that I could vote for without holding my nose a little bit. Mm-hmm. And that was because of the humanity and humanitarianism of Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney, unlike many of today's crop, and you just mentioned Poilievre being one of them, Brian Mulroney never darkened the room that he walked into. Brian Mulroney didn't have a a chip on the shoulder, and I'm not going to scoop myself too much here. I've got a Free Press column coming out on Saturday about this, but Brian Mulroney wasn't like many of today's conservatives like Pierre Poilievre, who appear to have a chip on their shoulder that's heavier than the Rock of Gibraltar. It's not attractive. And I don't know why it's attractive to some people. I guess some people are chronically angry or rageful, but that's not what I call a people person. That's not what I call someone who will be good at public service. That's not someone who I think is someone who is good at leadership. That's not someone who will want to have people surrounding him or her that aren't sycophants, that aren't bootlickers. I find that kind of rageful, authoritarian manner to be the kind of person that I never want to work for. I know that you've probably worked for some people like that, and you may have lasted 5 or 10 minutes, but it's hard to root for a boss who treats you the way some of these anger merchants treat their people.
Yeah, Mulroney wasn't like that. You know, he loved the game. He loved the business. He loved talking to guys like, you know, you, and phoning up at Charles, you know, how am I doing? How am I doing? and he was good at it. And he didn't demonize us, and nor did he demonize, more than was necessary, his opponents. You know, he had that human dimension, but so too did my boss. And so did, you know, that crop, where you got to love people in this business. You got to care about people. You're not getting into it to be rich. The only time you leave politics if you're rich or if you're a crook. You're not, you know, you're doing it because you want to help people. And Muldoon, you know, just I've got a column out too about him that I hammered out before deadline last night. And you know, what is it that was special about the guy? And for sure, you know, won big elections and won this party's leadership and so on. But getting back to a point you made a couple minutes ago, he was a progressive conservative, which is an oxymoron. That name doesn't exist for that political party anymore. It's now just a conservative party. Yeah. But like, okay, 1985, 1986, he's in his first majority. And his friends, political friends internationally, are two people he cannot afford to piss off: Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, you know, they condemn apartheid in South Africa, which is institutionalized racism. It is tyranny over people on the basis of the color of their skin. Those two would do nothing. In fact, they oppose sanctions. Who led the charge internationally against South Africa? Who led the charge for sanctions? Little old Canada and Brian Mulroney. They did that. That took tremendous courage. That was a risk for him politically, because there were many people in his party, as you remember, who were not happy that he was doing that. I'll just follow Reagan and Thatcher in their wake and you'll be fine. And he said no. So when Mandela was finally released from prison, where he'd been held for almost 3 decades, one of the first places he came was here. Came to Canada, thanked us, but he thanked Brian Mulroney, because everybody knew Mulroney took a huge risk of opposing this foul-feeded racism that existed in South Africa. And, you know, that was the kind of guy he was. Same with free trade. You know, a lot of aspects of free trade are unpopular these days, but that took guts to do. And then I think, you know, when he did Meech Lake and the GST, I think that's what finally turned people against him. They felt perhaps he wasn't listening to them anymore. They didn't want those things. And but, you know, GST is still with us and is 10% of government revenue, and Meech Lake has happened in all but name.
Warren, help me with something that was the focal point of my talk show in Calgary for quite a long time. The Distinct Society. Brian Mulroney wanted to build a bridge to Quebec. I don't want to get into the weeds of all the constitutional stuff. I admired your boss for just putting the constitutional stuff aside, because it was only a divider, your boss being Jean Chrétien. But Brian Mulroney really wanted to do this Quebec thing. Help me understand what that's about, because I will always believe that is really what led to the demise of his popularity, and I don't know whether he ever wanted to do a third term, but I think that made it impossible for him to win another election.
Yeah, I agree. And it's what put me into politics. You know, I was practicing, I was a litigator in Ottawa, 99 Bank Street. The next building was this retired politician named Jean Chrétien. And I'd see him at lunchtime, you know, having a sandwich and line up by himself. And I dug that. And then along comes this agreement between the premiers to insert into the Constitution of Canada, our supreme statute, a phrase that Quebec is a distinct society. And, you know, in my books, as a lawyer, as a citizen, you don't stick an interpretive phrase into the Constitution without at least finding out what it's going to mean. And they refused to let it get defined. And I said, to hell with this bullshit. I'm going to find a politician to oppose it. And they were the only one. It was Jean Chrétien. And as it turned out, quite a few of the country felt as Chrétien did. And that's when I started working for him, was over Meech Lake. And I agree with you. That was a huge mistake that Muldoon made. And the GST wasn't a mistake. He was right. All right. You know, I remember Chrétien saying to me, maybe he'll get mad at me for telling you this, but, you know, we were speaking privately one day, and, you know, Turner and Sheila Copps and Paul Martin, they were all, you know, against GST, and they were holding up in the Senate. Remember that? And they're blowing kazoos and all that kind of shit. And Chrétien said to me, do you think they're doing this because they know it's going to be popular? I was like, no. He said, they know it's going to be unpopular. They're doing it because the country's broke. We need the revenue. And so, and, you know, that ended up being why we kept it, because we needed the revenue. The country was broke. And, you know, we were front page of The Economist. They were calling us a third world country. So Mulroney was right. And I still think he was wrong on Meech. But in both those cases, I think the thread that runs through all of it, GST, Meech, free trade, all of it, and you and I have talked about this many times over the years, you can't be in people's faces every day, right? This is one thing I learned from Chrétien. Do your job, right? But you don't have to be on the front page of the newspaper every single morning. And that was the mistake that Mulroney and his guys made, is they were always in the news. And that's how you speed up your best before date. People get sick of you, they get sick of your face, and they want you gone. And, you know, that's when he had to pack it in, because they were sick of his face.
Warren, as you know, I'm a Cold War baby. I'm a refugee. I was born overseas. I'm a refugee from a communist country. And that's why I'm in Canada today. And that's why I'm grateful to the people of Canada forever, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with me on anything at all. This is my family's promised land. Now, the leader of this land, Brian Mulroney, was no longer the leader. He was a retired politician and a very, very skilled businessman when he was invited to another land, the United States of America, invited there by a former First Lady called Nancy Reagan, invited to deliver the eulogy at the Washington Cathedral 20 years ago at the state funeral of Ronald Reagan. People can have different views, and my view, as I always put my views in the shop window, all my biases, people know them. I put them right up front. I am biased against communism. I'm biased against the Soviet Union. I was biased in favor of Ronald Reagan because he called the Soviet Union what it was, an evil empire. And I'm biased in favor of Brian Mulroney because at that eulogy for Ronald Reagan, Brian Mulroney made sure that the whole world understood how important that issue was. In my humble opinion, the two greatest speeches made by foreigners on U.S. soil were Winston Churchill in 1941, when he pleaded with Americans to join the war against fascism, to save the world from tyranny. Winston Churchill was a closer, and he closed the deal in 1941 in that speech, the greatest speech, in my opinion, in America delivered by a foreigner. The second greatest, in my opinion, was the eulogy delivered 20 years ago in Washington by Brian Mulroney. Do you recall watching that speech either live or later on YouTube or elsewhere? Do you recall the words of Brian Mulroney 20 years ago at the state funeral for Ronald Wilson Reagan?
I don't recall the exact words, but I recall the occasion because the occasion was momentous. Like the thing is, a lot of people in Canada, I think, sometimes forget we are a small country with little to no military, diplomatic, and economic power. We're a little country. And so when the big leagues, when they pay attention to us, it's a big deal. And sometimes it's for, bad stuff. A prime minister wearing blackface and write about that, make fun of us, or, a snowstorm or whatever. But for Brian Mulroney to be invited by Ronald Reagan's widow to speak at his funeral was a testament not just to Mulroney's skills as a speech maker, but also to us. And, I don't feel like we would get an invitation now. We barely get an invitation to a lot of stuff these days. And, it was a testament to the man's skills as a communicator, but as also a person. Now, the paradox is that, he got us a free trade agreement. He successfully did that. He had forged a relationship with successive U.S. presidents that I don't think has been equaled since. However, the perception grew here, and I think the free trade agreement put gasoline on it, that he had grown too close to the United States. I was saying to my gal, we were in Kennebunk last summer as we go in Maine every summer, as you know. I took her out to Walker's Point, where the Bushes live, and I pointed to it, and that's the compounds there and the Secret Service and all that stuff. I said, Brian Mulroney's been in that building more than any other Canadian. And that, the Americans loved him. But a lot of Canadians got angry with him because they felt he'd gotten too close to the Americans. And that, I think, was one of the factors in his eventual departure.
Well, Brian Mulroney spent a lot of time in Palm Beach, where he had a home, Palm Beach, Florida, not terribly far from Mar-a-Lago. I don't know how much time he spent with Donald Trump, but I know that Mulroney has built bridges to political people all around the world, including America. He's close to what I'll call the Bush-Reagan wing of the Republican Party, but he was also in touch with Donald Trump. Just help me here as a human being and political observer. What is it about the makeup of Brian Mulroney, and what was it about his makeup that allowed him to have that kind of breadth and depth?
Well, the Americans would listen to him, including Donald Trump. But I know for a fact, because I know some of the Mulroney family quite well, I know Mulroney disapproved of Donald Trump's style of politics. At the outset, just like Justin Trudeau has had to do at the outset of the Trump administration, Canada, it's like, Justin's dad used to say, we're a mouse, sleeping beside an elephant. They roll over, God help us. So you have to forge a working relationship, a cordial relationship with an American president. Every Canadian prime minister has had to do that. It's critical. But I think Mulroney and Chrétien and Harper and all of them came to be just appalled by the way in which Donald Trump conducts himself and how he exercised power. And I don't think any of those men approved of how Trump behaved. I think Mulroney was deployed by Trudeau to see if they could soften Trump up, particularly when Trump tore up the free trade agreement and Chrystia Freeland was hitting her head on the wall with the American negotiators. They sent down Muldoon to see if they could, he could work some of the Irish magic with Trump. I think it worked to some extent because Freeland ended up concluding that agreement. And it was basically the same agreement as before with a different name. I can't even remember the stupid name that Trump gave it. But, Mulroney, I think it was an all hands on deck effort for Canada. And Mulroney was part of it.
Yeah, it's just thought of NAFTA, as NAFTA too, Reagan. I'm thinking about Reagan here because because of the Reagan funeral where Mulroney spoke, and I'm just thinking that Reagan would condemn so much about what Trump is doing these days.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But before I let you go here, I'm just going to ask you to put your lawyer's hat on, as I want to do. The Supreme Court of the United States, there's something about the word Supreme Court. They're almost holy. They're holy to all of us who love democracy, because we all understand that democracy cannot stand without the rule of law. I cannot stand the decision that the United States Supreme Court made this week, and I have a feeling that the Supreme Court hurt itself, hurt the legacy of the Supreme Court in deciding clearly to favor Donald Trump and to help him delay the major trial. There are a lot of charges against him, 91, but the major trial was going to be former war crimes prosecutor Jack Smith going against Donald Trump for sedition with reference to the events of January 6, 2021. In your legal opinion, what did the Supreme Court do this week to rig, I don't use those words lightly, to rig the election?
Donald Trump's legal strategy is simple. It is to rag the puck. He's facing 91 criminal charges in essentially 4 major prosecutions, from everything from improper storage of classified documents to sedition to election fraud. So he's in deep shit. And so his strategy is as follows: rag the puck as long as you can, make use of those prosecutions, make yourself out to be a victim, and then in the event he becomes president of the United States, pardon himself. Because when you're president of the United States, you can pardon anybody, including yourself. So that's what I think he's up to. And the Supreme Court of the United States, I think you're a lot nicer as usual than I am. I think a significant chunk of them are criminals. Clarence Thomas is a criminal and a sexual harasser. And it was a disgrace that he ever became a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the rest of them make me sick to my stomach. They are not lawyers anymore. They are partisan water boys. And so he wanted a delay, and they gave it to him on the basis of basically no argument and no evidence whatsoever. So, but at the end of the day, it's politics. One thing I believe, right? You know, eventually there's always a price to pay. And if they don't get him in one prosecution, they're going to go after him in the next one. They're going to go after him in the next one. And I think they're going to get him sooner or later. I don't know if he'll ever serve time behind bars, but as we've seen in the Jean Carroll case, that we've seen in the, basically the chicanery that his companies were up to in New York State, eventually they get him. It's just, unfortunately, it's going to take some considerable time.
Will Rogers once said, I've never been a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat. The attorney, in my opinion, and you can agree or disagree as always, but the Attorney General, this would be Joe Biden's Attorney General,
Merrick Garland.
Merrick Garland was so incredibly late at appointing a special counsel, Jack Smith, on the January 6th business. He was so late that, in my opinion, he sowed the seeds for the ugly crop that is being harvested by the Supreme Court.
Yep. You know what it is, and I count myself as a progressive still. You know what it is about progressive? Conservatives have no boundaries. Progressives do. To me, that's how I define progressives and conservatives. We have boundaries, they don't. But I'm one of those progressives who doesn't believe in boundaries. Do you want to have a fight? Then we'll have a fucking fight. Let's go. Like, drop the gloves. Let's have a fight. And Merrick Garland is one of those guys. He's like, oh, I need to be seen to be fairer than fair, whiter than white, purer than pure. I'm going to appoint Trump's guy to review the conduct of Joe Biden. He's done this time and time again. And this is where, what was her name? Clinton's Attorney General.
Jen?
The tall woman with the glasses.
Yeah, Janet, last name,
Anyway,
it
that
was
one.
really, it was
Okay.
Janet. Yeah,
She created Ken Starr.
yeah,
It
that's
wasn't
right.
the Republican Party. She did it. Like,
Yeah,
we're always doing this to
yeah,
ourselves,
yeah.
right? And it's like, I'm just sick of it. Like, it's, you want to have a fight, we'll have a fight. But like, I'm not going to hand you a loaded gun and say, shoot me. And this is what progressives do too often. It's what Democrats in particular do. Trudeau, to his credit, doesn't do it that much. But man, oh man, it just drives me bananas. And then Democrats run around saying, "Oh, this is terrible." It's like, oh yeah, well, you did it to yourself.
Yeah. No, by the way, I don't want to pretend to be a progressive. I've been a small c conservative for most of my adult life, and in the American context, I definitely was a Republican, but I was a moderate Republican. I never would have made it as a Trump Republican. But having said all of that, the Merrick Garland, the Attorney General for Joe Biden, I just don't understand, because how long does it take after what happened on January 6th, the attempted coup? How long does it take to appoint a special counsel to have a trial of Donald Trump? And it took him not months, but years to
Yep.
appoint a special counsel. So, while the Supreme Court did what it did, and both of us agree that it's egregious, there's no way the Supreme Court would have had a chance to delay, and stop this thing had Merrick Garland
He's a
not made
great
that tall
lawyer.
error.
He's
Yeah,
a great lawyer, but lawyers make for terrible politicians, right? Mulroney was a lawyer,
yeah.
but he was a better politician. And like, sometimes you got to take the gloves off and you got to duke it out. And the gentle kind of repartee you see in court, that doesn't exist in politics. And Mulroney was a practitioner of that. He knew that. He was one of the greatest labor lawyers that Quebec ever had. He was able to stitch together deals with Quebec trade unions, which and I know are some of the toughest unions to deal with in the country. Mulroney was able to do that. But, the skill he had as a politician, I think, was far greater. And, the proof's in the pudding. He was a winner, and he was somebody who took risks.
Warren, I've only got a couple of minutes left here, but I wanted to end this on a personal note, as always. Can you recall any story at all, personal, you and Brian Mulroney, your political enemy, about anything at all that may have happened to your life or his, where you could share an anecdote with us before we leave?
Chrétien had a health scare when we were in opposition. I was his special assistant, and in politics, you stumble, your opponents can be on you like packs of dogs. And the Paul Martin guys were out there saying, "Oh, Chrétien is dying. He's dying," and I was livid. I was so upset, and I wanted to just, I wanted to fight back. And phone rings. There he is, Brian Mulroney. Put your boss on the line. How is he? Want you to communicate Mila and I, because they were a package, our best wishes. And that was the kind of guy he is. And like, I don't see Pierre Poilievre doing that. I don't see a lot of them doing that kind of stuff these days. That's gone. And I don't know if we can ever get it back, Charles, but God knows we need to. We need to have some decency in our public life these days. I think people are starving for it. They desperately need an Obama, or a Muldoon, or one of those ones who loves people. And they're kind of hard to find these days.
I started this podcast by saying that I don't have much time for partisanship on these things. One reason is I just find partisans boring and predictable.
Yeah, they're boring. Yeah,
you've never been boring. You've never been predictable. You're an artist and a lawyer, and you're a friend. I love you, Warren Kinsella. Thank you very much for this.